John is retired professor Emeritus in Old Testament from Wheaton College, written a ton of books, and we've got two of them over here in our library in case you're interested, and half of them are called The Lost World of something. The Lost World of Genesis, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, The Lost World, and we've got one of them called The Lost World of the Prophets. It's a great book. I would encourage you to take a look at it. He's written on the prophets as well as some of the other scholars who are here. John loves students. He loves people. He loves to be in their company. He loves to talk. He loves to mentor. And he was consistently in the presence of students at times when his classes were not meeting because he wanted to continue the conversation. So this is a true educator. And he's been educating all of his life. He served, he did a Ph.D. at the university, at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He worked at Moody Bible Institute, taught for there. And he taught at Wheaton College for about 25 years, right? 22 years. I am so delighted John is here. He's going to be sharing some things about Daniel 12 tonight and about his study in the book of Daniel. Some things maybe that you haven't thought about before, things that you don't know. Would you join me in welcoming John Walton here to the Stone Chapel?
Thank you. It's very good to be here, and I want to thank Mark Lanier for inviting me, David Capes for organizing it all, Jenny Enright and others on the staff who have made it all just a wonderful experience, and I'm grateful for all my colleagues that are here. And so I've been looking forward to this, and I'm very excited to share with you some ideas that, again, you haven't heard before. And maybe you'll like them, maybe you won't. That's okay. It's information, and that's sort of my job. And I'm going to try to make this work pretty well. Having the laptop in my manuscript is kind of tricky, but we'll see which one I drop how many times, and we'll work with it. So let me get started. I'm going to have the text in front of you on each slide. And every once in a while I'll fool with it. So that'll be there for your reference. So Daniel 12, 2 through 3. Is traditionally read as one of the first texts in the Hebrew Bible to describe a nascent doctrine of bodily resurrection. Harvard theologian John Levinson summarizes this position when he states, I quote, "The first transparent and indisputable prediction of the resurrection of the dead in the Hebrew Bible appears in Daniel 12, 1 through 3. Sounds pretty clear," end quote. Many also attribute to Daniel 12 the presentation of a hope for a differentiated afterlife, in which the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. This general consensus has held despite the recognition of numerous problems surrounding the meaning of Daniel chapter 12, particularly regarding what sort of doctrine of resurrection they reflect, if any. The most intractable problems are commonly recognized. The partial scope, multitudes who sleep, some to everlasting life. The nature of the descriptions of disparate destinies, shame and everlasting contempt, versus those who will lead many to righteousness, with no reference to place or essence. Where are they going to be? What are they going to be like? And the implications, finally, not least important, the reference to the stars, as you can see at the end of the passage. Will shine like the brightness of the heavens, like the stars. We will discuss each of these briefly and then propose an interpretation that explains these peculiarities. So we start with the partial scope. The text indicates that many, NIV reads it multitudes, as you can see there in the first word, multitudes will awake. To most interpreters, this has suggested that only some will awake, strengthened by the distributive use of some this and some that. while resurrection in both Judaism and Christianity is later understood to be universal in scope. In Daniel, it is described as partial. Many, but not all, will awaken from the land of dust. While this may be explained as a matter of selective concern only for a particular group, the righteous, the Jews, or those experiencing persecution under Antiochus, the selective resurrection of the dead differentiates Daniel from later Jewish and Christian presentations of resurrection, which leads us to ask, is this really resurrection? Disparate destinies. The second issue is the description of the disparate destinies of the wise. Those are the maskilim. I'll be using that term. The wise is one way to translate it. It's a group that's identified in the book of Daniel. So the destinies of the wise, and an unlabeled some who awake to shame and everlasting contempt. Scorn and enduring loathsomeness. Translations differ on these adjectives and nouns. The idea of disparate destinies for the righteous and the wicked after death is here an innovation within the Hebrew Bible, but was present in the book of Enoch, who had made such a distinction in 1 Enoch 22 and 1 Enoch 92, a century before the 2nd century setting of the book of Daniel. What is baffling, however, about the description of these destinies in Daniel is that, unlike in 1 Enoch, they are not forensic in nature. That is, they do not explicitly have to do with reward and punishment. Rather, they pertain to how one party is perceived, scorn and reproach, and how the other continues to function to lead many to righteousness. That's a difference. Also of significance, this text gives indication of neither place nor essence, as I've mentioned. That is, it does not tell us the place where the resurrected are destined to continue to exist. Heaven, hell, Sheol, on earth, where? Or what their nature will be. Is this bodily resurrection? The text gives us no clue. Hence, these verses fall short, far short, of suggesting a universal bodily resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked to their respective destinies based on the judgment of God. Those elements are not there. And that is what reflects kind of the doctrine of resurrection. None of those elements is articulated, yet they are all important entailments of the later doctrine of resurrection, both among Jews and Christians. Now, of course, we don't want to neglect the reference to the stars. The final problem is the significance of the reference to the wise, maskilim, shining like stars. Some suggest that the reference to the stars provides sufficient evidence that the passage describes the fate of the wise in terms of astral exaltation. Whoa. Though such indications can be found scattered through Second Temple Jewish literature, exaltation kind of theology, this doctrine did not survive in Judaism or in Christianity. As a sampling, reference is made to passages in 1 Enoch 104, verse 2, shine like the luminaries in the heavens, 1 QS 11, 5 through 8, joined to the sons of heaven, the Testament of Moses 10:9, fix you firmly in the heaven of the stars. So we have these scattered references. Whatever path we take, this element appears to stand as an outlier, at best, in resurrection theology. One must also deal with the force of the kaf preposition here. It's like the stars that they are compared. The text does not say that those who awake from the dust become stars. It describes their activity, which is described as analogous to the stars. A final observation to consider that further problematizes the question is that if this text is to be taken as a nascent expression of the belief in the resurrection of the dead, it is curious that it does not appear to function that way in the texts of early Judaism or Christianity. This is an argument from silence, to be sure, but if Daniel 12 really does function as the first transparent and indisputable prediction of the resurrection of the dead in the Hebrew Bible, as Levinson claims, it is surprising that it's not referenced as such a passage in its early reception. The Qumran community shows some evidence of a developing belief in resurrection, a few scattered passages, messianic apocalypse, the Lord will raise them up, and the one who causes his people to live. Though the Qumran community was patently aware of the book of Daniel, they do not use Daniel 12, 2 and 3 in any of the references to resurrection. While the Qumran texts cite other texts from Daniel as they develop their views on resurrection, they do not clearly use Daniel 12, 1 to 3 to do so. Furthermore, contra some scholars, such as Sigvardsson, very thorough analysis that he does, who claim some allusions in other early literature, we contend that the use of Daniel to support ideas of bodily resurrection is unattested in Second Temple Jewish literature, including that very famous passage in 2 Maccabees 7 with the widow and her 7 sons, where she keeps referring to resurrection, but Daniel doesn't come into that discussion. Furthermore, it's not in the New Testament, and it's not in the earliest layers of Jewish and Christian interpretation in the early centuries CE. Second Temple literature evidences no articulation of a doctrine of bodily resurrection with differentiated destinies that invokes or alludes to the distinctive language of Daniel 12. There are a few references to being like stars that may be echoes of Daniel, but this is already evident in Enoch. And these references do not refer to Daniel 12, 2 and 3 in any distinctive way that would differentiate the meaning from what we find in the book of Enoch. Referring to death as sleep is common enough in the Hebrew Bible, so the idea of resurrection as awakening from sleep cannot automatically be seen as a reference to Daniel. Likewise, the reference to eternal life is too widespread to constitute an intrinsic allusion to Daniel. The fact that Enoch has some discussion of resurrection shows that such ideas were circulating in Second Temple Judaism before the setting of Daniel in the 2nd century and outside of Daniel. Therefore, the presence of resurrection ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls alone does not demonstrate a reliance on Daniel. The earliest explicit use of Daniel 12, 2 and 3 that we could find, and maybe somebody here can point me to something different, but that's the earliest we could find, featuring differentiated destinies is in the early Christian literature. First in Hippolytus, in his commentary, and then regularly from the 4th century CE on. About a century earlier than Hippolytus, 2 Baruch 51 discusses those who are resurrected, and in that discussion, reference is made to the righteous being made like the angels and equal to the stars. That's 2 Baruch 51:10. This could be argued to include Daniel 12:3 in a discussion of resurrection, but the connection is tenuous. Outside of the descriptions of those who have been saved as equal to stars, Baruch lacks distinctive reference to Daniel 12. The absence of Daniel 12 in these early discussions of resurrection raises the question. If Daniel was not read as contributing to the formulation of doctrines of resurrection for half a millennium after its setting, then how would the earliest interpreters have read it? What's the alternative here? How would they think about it? Once one sets aside the presupposition that these verses predict resurrection, some other features of the passage come into focus. And this leads us, of course, to exegetical observations. Both the verb shine, yashiru, from the root zahar, and the noun brightness, zohar, are derived from the same root, zayin, he, resh. All English translations render the verb as shine, thus treating it as a cognate of the noun, which is translated in this way elsewhere only in Ezekiel 8:2, where it relates to a shining heavenly personage. The meaning shine, however, would be unique for the verb in Hebrew Bible. The verb zahar occurs over 20 times in the Hebrew Bible and consistently means to warn. So my red print there. Consistently means to warn. For example, Ezekiel 3:21 reads, "If you warn the righteous person not to sin and he does not sin, he shall surely live, because he took the warning, and you will have delivered your soul." We have therefore considered an alternative translation. The wise will warn, Yashiru, like a luminary, that Zohar, of the heavens. Such a didactic meaning is strengthened in its parallelism with the function of leading many to righteousness, which, again, you can see in the text, which also suggests an instructive role for the wise, the masculine. That is, in their role as luminaries, they will lead many to righteousness. Furthermore, the clarification that they will lead many to righteousness like the stars suggests that the stars function in this verse as ideal teachers, rather than as measures of astral glory. The stars here, parallel to the heavens, refers to the constellations to which the wise are compared. The heavens and the stars. The word for stars, both the cognate in Akkadian as well as in Hebrew, can refer to the formations of the stars, the constellations. Based on all the foregoing analysis, the thesis that I would like to propose is that Daniel 12:2-3 neither outlines a doctrine of resurrection in which the righteous receive reward and the wicked judgment, nor describes the fate of the righteous in terms of astral exaltation. Instead, the imagery of the stars warning and leading connects the role of the wise to the didactic function of the host of heaven. This interpretation also illuminates the fate of the wicked. We noted above that Daniel 12 does not describe the wicked as receiving judgment. They rather are treated with scorn and contempt. Cherpa, reproach or loathsomeness, also plays a pedagogical role in Hebrew Bible. Yes, there it is. It too can be eternal. Jeremiah 23:40 describes everlasting reproach that will come upon Israel, not because they will suffer eternal judgment, but because their reproach is made public. Such eternal reproach shall not be forgotten. Since the text compares the destiny of the wise to the didactic function of the constellations, the crucial question to be asked is, how were the constellations and the stars believed to warn and instruct? You can see we're just taking our lead from the text. These are the verbs that are used, it's the comparison that is used, so we have to ask the question, how do the constellations do this? How do they warn and instruct? In this regard, the imagery of Daniel 12 indeed intersects with a key idea in Second Temple Judaism, but it is not the development of a belief in resurrection. It is instead the development of the connection between stars as constellations and their pedagogical function as the purveyor of divinely gifted wisdom, morality, and memory. This concept was commonplace in Hellenism, but it was not a recent invention. The stars in the sky had long been considered akin to a celestial script in Mesopotamian culture. As Francesca Rochberg explains, the heavenly writing functioned as a poetic metaphor that extended beyond the ideas of astrology or celestial divination. Instead, the notion of the stars as a heavenly script implies their capacity to be read and interpreted. Representing the work of the divine, the stars, written in the sky as they were conceived to be, could convey the sense of the eternal. Assyrian king Esarhaddon used astroglyphs, symbols corresponding to the constellations, to represent the words in his royal name. Inscriptions, including several of Nebuchadnezzar II, from the book of Daniel, describe the beauty of earthly temples as shining like the writings of the heavens. The metaphor of heavenly writing, therefore, related the stars and the constellations to cuneiform signs from which one could read and derive meaning, and thus expressed the idea that written messages were encoded in celestial phenomena. Lots of that is quoted from Francesca Rochberg, a leading Assyriologist on celestial divination. Our argument is strengthened by the fact that the wise are compared to both the heavens, the Rakia, and the stars, the Kokavim. That is, they are being compared not only to individual stars, but to their arrangement in constellations. Here's the key. The constellations were long considered a means by which beings were immortalized in story. Even as early as Sumerian literature, Dumuzi's Ascent is a literature piece that tells us how when Dumuzi, lover of the goddess Inanna, becomes mortally ill, she requests that he be able to ascend to heaven and be stationed there, though it's not clear whether he is a constellation or something else. An old Babylonian myth, Gira and Elamtum, describe how Gira, the god of fire, rescues the land from the evil Elamatum, who had brought famine and unproductive livestock. He is rewarded by being made a constellation, and his story is remembered when people look at the heavens. The villain in that tale is also translated to become a constellation, where he will stand forever in ignominy. The influence of Mesopotamian concepts of astronomy on early Jewish literature has recently been re-emphasized through Annette Yoshiko Reed's masterful study of the Astronomical Book. The Astronomical Book, or the Book of Heavenly Luminaries, is a Jewish text about Babylonian astronomy. It's written in Aramaic in the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC, right in this time period, shortly before contemporary with the writing of Daniel 12. In this book, the angel Uriel instructs Enoch in the ways of the luminaries of heaven. Their whole description, as they are, and for the years of the world to eternity until the creation, will be made anew to last forever. A quote from that text. Enoch then passes on these messages to his son Methuselah, whom he instructs to keep the book written by the hand of your father, so that you may give it to the generations of the world. 1 Enoch 82:1. Reed observes that in these texts, an intensification of interest in astronomy is paired with practices of pedagogy, shaped by new ethical and didactic concern. The constellations are leading to righteousness. The same interest in the didactic function of the stars is displayed in the new forms of Greek paideia that arise in the 3rd to 2nd centuries. In these works, cosmology and astronomy provide revealed knowledge, ideal for education and for moral formation. Eratosthenes, the librarian in the Library of Alexandria, for 50 years in the last half of the 3rd century BCE, compiled the Catasterismi, containing 44 etiologies of constellations. His work is preserved in an epitome by the anonymous author referred to as Pseudo-Eratosthenes in 1st and 2nd century CE in his work, The Constellations. Eratosthenes was preceded by Aratus, 315 to 250 BCE, in his work Phenomena, a poetical astronomy that discusses the positions and movements of the constellations with occasional reference to underlying mythology. As Reed writes, quote, in place of the Hesiodic assertion that the gods keep the means of life hidden from humans, Aratus proclaims Zeus as the one who benignly gives helpful signs to humans. And here's a quote from Emeritus. "For we men do not yet have knowledge of everything from Zeus, but much is still hidden, whereof Zeus, if he wishes, will give us signs anon. He certainly does benefit the human race openly, showing himself on every side and everywhere displaying his signs. Some things in the moon will tell you, for example, when halved on either side of full, or again when she is full, and other things the sun will tell you when rising and again in warnings at the beginning of the night." End quote. The movements of the stars in the heavens had long been considered special, secret knowledge, reserved for scribes and diviners. The propagation of astronomical texts in more accessible, didactically oriented forms marks a shift by which the stars might instruct the many. The constellations specifically were understood to immortalize stories. Theonokondos notes, "Most of the figures appearing in Greek constellations were placed there by one of the gods to honor and perpetuate the memory of some notable personage or deed. As examples, Andromeda is placed in the sky by Athena, Minerva, to memorialize the heroism and courage of Perseus, who slayed the Gorgon Medusa. Centaurus is Chiron, tutor of Asclepius and Achilles, who surpassed all in justice and righteousness, wisdom and skill. Hercules himself is placed in the sky by Zeus to honor his heroism in slaying the dragon guarding the golden apples. Virgo is associated with Dike, justice, who is described first as a prophet and a teacher, living on earth and gathering together the elders, either in the marketplace or in the broad highway, where she urged them in prophetic tones to judgments for the good of the people. As a result of moral deterioration, she goes into self-imposed exile and eventually into the heavens. Clearly then, the stars were understood to tell the stories of heroes and thereby instruct in a variety of virtues, whether we're talking about ancient Mesopotamia or Hellenistic world of the Second Temple Judaism. The heavens, however, were also filled with villains, most of whom are considered guilty of hubris. Cassiopeia, Orion, Niobe, Arachne, Tantalus, Sisyphus, you see the list. As is also true, of course, of the little horn in Daniel and his hubris. Presumably one of the main villains alluded to in Daniel 12, who will be subject to shame and reproach. Kondos observes that, quote, "the various accounts of Orion's death reflect a familiar theme in Greek myth. Any mortal who is guilty of hubris, i.e., who boasts of his prowess or otherwise challenges the gods, incurs divine retribution," end quote. The memory of them is forever tainted by the deeds that are commemorated in the stars. This would explain why the text of Daniel refers to shame and reproach, the tainted reputation of the villains, rather than referring to judgment or punishment that they would suffer. I should clarify that I am not arguing for direct lines of influence behind the Hellenistic cosmologies, the astronomical book, and the book of Daniel. But we do see parallel practices emerging contemporaneously. An interest in the broadly pedagogical functions of the stars as a means of heavenly writing that preserves memories eternally, analogous to the work of the scribes who preserve and amplify their instruction. Our proposed interpretation offers explanatory power to resolve the issues described and introduced at the beginning of the paper. The narrator indicates in verse 1 that many will be delivered when Michael arises. The narrator then anticipates the awkward and uncomfortable question: What about the faithful who have already died and are beyond deliverance? In response, the angel offers the allusion to Isaiah 26:19, as many scholars have recognized, which suggests that in some way the dead will awake. And note that he chooses to use the verb awake from Isaiah, not the verb arise, which is also in that context. Daniel does not offer an interpretation or explanation of Isaiah 26. Instead, he refers to a particular suggestion of how the awakening of the dead mentioned there might be understood in the context of the persecution being carried out by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. A redeployment of Isaiah 26. Nevertheless, the statements in the book of Daniel take their lead from Isaiah 26. In that context, the faithful dead of Israel are replacing the Rephaim. The Rephaim were the divinized dead kings. These kings were held in honor and continued after death in a privileged status as they were remembered for their deeds. In Isaiah 26:14, their memory is destroyed. In Daniel 12, the wise are the faithful dead who have the status that the Rephaim would have had in Isaiah 26. And the villains, instead of having their memory destroyed, as in Isaiah 26, experience instead eternal shame rather than honor. Our interpretation suggests that some, not all, will awake, that is, come to life, by being immortalized in heroic stories. That is enduring life. The others will experience being eternally villainized, contemptible, and loathsome to everyone who hears, enshrined in infamy. It is always only some whose lives are immortalized in this way. Their disparate destinies are described in terms of their pedagogical function. Some will lead and warn, as the heavens tell the stories of the great heroes in the Hellenistic constellation tales, and as the gods and angels communicate primeval knowledge through the skies, so the wise, Daniel's masculine, will be remembered in story. And their remembered lives of faithfulness will serve as guides to righteousness, a key virtue for the masculine, throughout all the ages. This is, in fact, how the stories of Daniel have functioned, as well as the stories of martyred Jews in the book of Maccabees. We tell their stories over and over, generation after generation, and their deeds live on. In this text, the point is being made that their eternal life will be in stories, not in bodies. Within this interpretation, Daniel 12 functions as the conclusion to the collection of tales and visions associated with the wise man Daniel. The stories in which the young Judeans reveal God's kingdom plans and purposes in the court of the Gentile king are some of those stories, immortalized like the stars, tales designed to warn and to lead, to comfort and correct. Daniel 12 functions, therefore, not as an expression of a new doctrine of resurrection, but as a fitting conclusion to a book of stories about those wise exiles whose lives serve a pedagogical and revelatory purpose like the stars in the sky, and even until today. Regardless of what sort of eternity various doctrines maintain for the faithful in some other state of existence, in this world, we all end up as stories. A quote from Doctor Who. in this world, we all become memories, which sometimes coalesce into stories. That observation reminds us of comments made by that great theologian, Dr. Who, and we can imagine him, at least I can, explaining Daniel 12 in his own vernacular. We are but lingering shadows that soon fade as they dissipate into the mists of time. Only a few experience resurrection from memory to story. That is, they awake from the dust of faded memory to take on new life as their stories are retold. Like the constellations of the heavens that enshrine stories of the unforgotten, their stories will broadcast their legacy. Some will live on in infamy, villainized through stories that subject them to repeated scorn and a reproach in endless cycle. They deserve it. But others will be immortalized as events are filtered into memory, and memories coalesce into stories that then echo through time and eternity, inspiring generation after generation to have hope in their undaunted pursuit of righteousness and wisdom. I believe fully in the doctrine of resurrection, but I do not find it in these verses. But I find something that's powerful and moving. As Daniel gives a message to his audience, in the midst of all the death, martyrdom, destruction of Antiochus Epiphanes, this is the hope he gives them. Live your lives well. Your stories will reverberate throughout eternity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. If you were going to argue against your interpretation, what would be your most salient argument?
You know, we've tried hard to think of one. Where does this fall apart? Obviously, we're drawing connections for what we see in ancient literature, and
especially Greek.
Yeah, but also Mesopotamian.
But if you look at things like Gira, the Mesopotamian story you referenced, Gira, the fire god, if I'm not mistaken, was not so much stories as omens. As the stars would appear, they would be the omens of some galactic fire that was going to happen on Earth. They were a warning in that sense.
Yeah, certainly in Mesopotamian context, the use of the constellations and the stars for omens was the prominent way. But we tried to pick those examples that actually moved to the next step, to story. You know, these are all speculative pieces being put together, but what we feel is that the explanatory power it offers accounts for all the details, whereas the other explanations connected to resurrection don't seem to do so as much.
All right. What, if anything, does historian Josephus say about Daniel?
Nothing about the resurrection from chapter 12. I couldn't catalog all the ways he talks about Daniel. He knows Daniel well and makes reference to the events in Daniel. He refers to Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus and by different names sometimes, but nonetheless. But he doesn't reference Daniel 12 in a concept of resurrection.
Okay. We have several people who are curious if your position changes based upon the dating of Daniel. If some date it during a Persian period as opposed to the Antiochus Epiphanes era.
And no, it really doesn't, because most of our interpretation is based on the actual things that are in the text, the words that are there and the meanings that they have. Certainly there's additional explanatory power when we see the Hellenistic literature, but it's really not dependent on that. It's dependent on the language of the text.
Okay, certainly with an Antiochus dating, you've got, I would think, a much greater familiarity. Anytime you're post Alexander the Great, you've got a greater familiarity with at least the Greek ideas of that you discussed. Okay, I'm getting a boatload. I'm trying to. Okay, would you talk in general, and you do a wonderful job of this in some of your books, but would you talk in general about the role of using literature from the same time period when you're interpreting biblical text, especially in the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm. So when we use literature from the ancient world, whether it's Hellenistic or Babylonian, or when we're referring to that literature, we're not trying to suggest that the Bible is indebted to that literature. Rather, we suggest that the authors of Scripture, the Israelites themselves, the authors and audiences, are embedded in that ancient world. And the more we can understand about that ancient world, the more we might see glimpses of ways of thinking that are also characteristic of Israelites. So we read the literature from the ancient world to prompt us to ask a different set of questions than we would ask from our modern standpoint, to kind of see ways that people were thinking differently, and then to consider whether the Israelites might be thinking more like us or more like Babylonians. We find lots of times they think more like Babylonians, even in places where God was trying to get them to stop that. But there are lots of places where it didn't matter to God that they're thinking like ancient world people. And so the ancient literature gives us a context. It gives us an understanding of what I call their cultural river. All literature is written in conversation with those around you. It can't be any other way. You write in a context. And so it's no surprise that the Israelites wrote in the context of the ancient world, and they had certain assumptions that they shared with the ancient world, even though their theology was going a very different direction.
I would give an illustration. If we were to all wear a red hat that had white letters that said, "Make theology great again," we would best understand that hat in light of our culture today. It is a language that, otherwise people would be at a loss to try and understand.
Otherwise, it would just be a silly hat.
Yeah. Is it possible for both understandings of the text to be true?
We interpret from a vantage point. And I talked about this some yesterday for those of you who are here. The vantage point is always an important aspect of how we interpret. We can't help but interpret from a vantage point. When we're trying to read this text in context, we're trying to read it from an Israelite, or more specifically a Judean vantage point, to see what that audience and that author would have had in mind, how they would have understood it from their vantage point. That means shedding a little bit of our vantage point, at least trying to push it aside. And yet the time comes when we want to read as Christians, from a Christian vantage point, from a theological vantage point, where we accept a doctrine of resurrection. And from that vantage point, with that theology in place, we might look at a place like Daniel 12 and say, that kind of reminds me of a doctrine of resurrection. And it may well, because we have that firmly implanted in our theological framework. So it wouldn't be surprising that it would do so. That's a different level of reading, and I like to differentiate the text in context reading from the various vantage points that we could read. Vantage points can often draw out truth, okay? But that doesn't mean that they get us to the authority of the text, which I connect to text in context. Now, of course, that's a whole reading method that's involved, but that's how I would draw that distinction.
All right, if you would go back a couple of slides to where we've got the text of Daniel 2, 3. All right, this one's fine. I wonder if people would also quiz you on whether or not you can take verse 2. Let's take verse 3 and keep your reading intact. Those who are wise will warn like the brightness of the heavens. They will, give the warnings, the omens, the whatever. Those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. But still see in verse 2 the idea of something akin to the Isaiah passage, because it uses the same word awake, it uses the same word dust, this idea that multitudes who sleep will awake as opposed to just rise up. Is it possible to still see the significance of some of what you're doing, but still see somewhere in here a resurrection?
Again, from our vantage point, we might be able to say, well, look, that looks very familiar to me. And that's fine, but that's our vantage point. I'm suggesting that no one in the time of Daniel, whatever date you put Daniel, would have seen that aspect. And in fact, that plays out because in the first 500 years of interpretation, people didn't read it that way. So you could do so, but our question, of course, as you know, when we interpret Scripture, it's not a matter of what we can do. What can I get away with? What of what I believe to be true can I read into it? Well, that would give us a pretty blank check to work with. So we want to, I talk about trying to be tethered to the author, tracking with the author. And if we're doing that, we can't just isolate sentences like that and say, this makes me think.
But you would give us that Daniel 12:2 is clearly reverberating out of Isaiah.
Yes, absolutely. But again, as I mentioned, he doesn't use the very specific verb arise, which Isaiah 26 does, and this does not. He uses awake.
But Isaiah 26 uses awake as well.
Yes, they both use awake.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe this text has the function? Do you believe this text has the same function or revelation idea as Hebrews 11 and the cloud of witnesses? These are stories.
Didn't think of that, but that's an interesting connection to make. Again, it's the same concept of those who are testifying. They would see the constellations as testifying. I like that. If I use it, I'll footnote it. You can tell me who said that.
I know that Pastor Jarrett's preaching on that chapter right now, so maybe it was his note. I don't know. Worth a footnote to at least Champion Forest Baptist Church. Let's see. I'm trying to be sensitive to time. Do you see anything in all of this to the wise men from the east using the stars to guide them?
I mean, again, that's an interesting
That's mine, by
concept.
the way.
Yeah. Oh.
Footnote that.
Oh, well, then I'll change my statement about that then.
I'm just saying, if we talk about stars being omens in that culture and in that time, clearly the Magi saw an omen in the stars.
But I don't see them being warned or leading in righteousness. They're leading them to righteousness, if you say that's Jesus. But, you got some jumps there. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of people have asked questions, so I'm going to do a synopsis of these, and I'm sorry if I cheated you on the exact verbiage of your question. But a lot of people are not that familiar with the book of Enoch, the book of the secrets of Enoch, First Enoch, all of that stuff. Would you explain where you see that as useful and instructive, but the difference between that and a canonical book?
Sure. So the book of Enoch developed in several phases. The earliest part, and I hope I get this all right because Andrew Perrin's sitting here who knows a lot more about it than I do, but the earliest part, the Book of the Watchers, is generally dated to the 3rd century BCE. And so it would post-date a Babylonian Daniel, but predate Hellenistic Daniel. Then there are other sections of it that develop as time goes on. For a long time, only part of it was known from Ethiopic texts, but it shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a lot more is known about it these days. It stands as one of the earliest Jewish texts outside the Bible, right? Because if it's 3rd century, we don't have a whole lot of Jewish texts that are not in the Bible from that time period. Again, we could take a look at some of the apocryphal works and see how that worked out. But that makes it very significant. It's also apocalyptic in nature, so that makes it important for Daniel. So again, just like we might look at Babylonian omen texts, or the Emeritus, or all of those Hellenistic texts, the book of Enoch is a Jewish text which can help us understand how Jews were thinking in that time period, some of the ideas that were floating around. So it gives testimony to Jewish thinking in that time period. And that means it's very interesting to compare. How does what Daniel has to say compare? In what ways is it the same? What ways is it different? We don't count the book of Enoch among our canonical books, but it's still important Jewish literature and helps us to understand the times and the culture in which it was written, as well as that type of literature, apocalyptic.
Okay, I'm trying to find that one last question, and I've flipped past many of your questions, and y'all can hold that against me. This is just as good as any. Am I the only one? All capitalized question mark. Yesterday's panel discussion and today, Lord of the Rings, stars as ancient heroes, the wicked and/or noble warriors and kings, the heroic dead, John Walton, truth. I can't understand that, but...
Wow. I'm not sure if Lord of the Rings is truth, or if I am, or if none of us are, or
I'm not sure either.
Is the essence of that might be, am I the only one that's missed these connections? And no, these are connections that we've developed, Aubrey and I, Dr. Buster, in our commentary from a deep study of the texts and the literature surrounding it. And these new connections have been suggested to us in our research from what we've devised. So you shouldn't think that, how come I've never heard of this before? You haven't, because it hasn't been published. These are the ideas that have come out of our 7 years of research in the book of Daniel. That's the tribulation period, by the way.
Yeah. You had discussed some of this with me a couple of years ago when you were here, and to see the way you fleshed it out and developed it is impressive. So I want to say thank you very much for coming here and letting us get in on a nascent view of your view of the nascent idea of Daniel 12:2-3 being bodily resurrection, our story. So would you join me one more time in thanking Dr. Walton?